We have been creating art since the beginning of time. When archaeologists are digging things up, they're finding out more and more about civilizations as a result of the art that they created. Having access to art is having access to a part of who we are in the greater scheme of humanity. It was the experience in connecting. It was the experience in creating that space for people to talk about things that maybe they wouldn't have had a space to talk about.
Welcome to Express Change, a podcast about art and activism.
Right now, we're treating people and the planet like they're here to serve the economy, when really it should be the other way around. What will it take for us to reimagine and remake our economies to deliver social justice on a healthy planet? We're part of a global movement that's trying to do just that.
There's a popular saying, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. Our cultural mainstream hardly ever imagines what a different system could look like. We want to find out how new and innovative art can help us change our view on politics, economics, the world, and our fate.
To get to these answers, we'll talk to artists and creatives from a wide range of fields, backgrounds, and parts of the world. I am Marina Gattas, Culture and Public Policy Lead at the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, based in São Paulo, Brazil.
And I am Martin Oetting, an artist and writer based in Berlin, Germany. Thank you so much for listening. This is episode 1 of Express Change. Shirley Rodriguez brings 20 years of experience in media production to her role as president and creative director of Create the Remarkable, a New York-based, minority-owned production company. With Create the Remarkable, Shirley has been able to combine her joy for storytelling, her attention to detail and imagery, her background in marketing, and her history in community organizing to create media that has an impact. She's an award-winning photographer and was selected as one of 10 artists commissioned to produce a mini-documentary for the Small Business in America series. Shirley, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be part of this conversation.
We wanted to hear, first of all, in your own words, how does art and activism come together in your work?
I think that everything I do when it comes to art is connected to activism, even though I may not consciously be thinking that it is. Art for me is just part of my life, and it always has been. The one thing I always wanted to be when I was a kid was an artist. The thing is that I really didn't have access to seeing the work of other artists who looked like me or that had my experience. And I think that I spent so much of my adult life trying to create that access for other people. It's so important for people to be seen. It's so important for people to be heard. And I think that the purpose of my work, both professionally and personally, has been in doing just that, making sure that people are seen and people are heard. And it also provides an outlet for me to express myself.
This sort of lack of figures or references that looked like you or had your same experience. I was wondering, who were those inspirational figures that you first encountered that actually made you feel like this is also my place and this is somewhere that I can be and I do belong in art?
I was really, really blessed. I grew up in New York City, which is such a mecca of art. The access that I had to art was slightly different. It wasn't access in terms of me going necessarily to museums. I went to museums on school trips. My parents really weren't museum goers. They were working class and they didn't really have the time to go to museums and take me. But I remember as a kid being completely fascinated. The elevated train would pass by our window. And this was the 1980s in New York City. And the elevated trains were completely, we would say tagged up. They were completely full of graffiti. And And I would just run to the window whenever the train was coming because it was an opportunity to see what I felt and still feel was the most amazing street art imaginable. And that was my first access to seeing art. Imagine being 5 years old and being able to look outside your window every now and then, and it's just this mobile art gallery. And so that was really great for me. I was also really blessed because by the time that I was 11, I was 10 or 11, I was in a specialized middle school that really concentrated on the arts. So I ended up studying art for the 4 years that I was in that middle school, the 3 or 4 years I was in that middle school. It was amazing. I actually had a foundation in art that was very equal to the art classes that I ended up taking in college. The students were primarily of color. It was a school that was named after a prodigy who was of color, Philippa Schuyler. And being able to be in a school that was run by people of color, they taught us that we were so important and that we were important in the world and that we had something really amazing to contribute. And it was a lesson that has stuck with me, particularly in realizing that so many other young people didn't get that same message. And that's, I think, one of the reasons that I also, for many years, was a teaching artist, to give young people the opportunity to understand that their voice and their point of view, their eye, was something that could really change things.
Graffiti on trains. That is such a grunge way of getting into it. I was wondering, is that still in you? Like that directional push still has sort of a say in the way you see, perceive, and make art today?
I think that the influence of the graffiti when I was growing up and seeing that, the way that it's affected my art now, is really in my connection to being someone who grew up in New York City and the community that I've embraced and has embraced me my entire life. It was a form of expression for people who weren't being celebrated as artists. And there's something about them stepping in and saying, I want to create art. They painted with paint. I see myself as an artist who paints primarily with light. As a photographer, that's really what it is. And people, in a way, are the canvas, and the art is the paint. And what really is the catalyst for me and my art is the trust that I develop with these people.
So what came first? Art or activism? And then when did these two things become intertwined? Have you always seen art as a catalyst for change, or did this develop? How did that trajectory go?
I did not always see art as a catalyst for change, but one of the things that most influenced me in becoming a community organizer when I was very young, I started community organizing when I was about 15 or 14 years old. And what happened was I read this amazing book that I still have a few copies of. It was called A Puerto Rican in New York. It was by a journalist, author named Jesus Colon. And he documented the experience of Puerto Ricans in New York, but he did it in such a way that was so beautiful and so magical. And it was a collection of short stories and essays and articles that had been published many years ago. One of the reasons that he was writing this book was so that there would be someone in a future generation who was Puerto Rican growing up in New York who would write the next one. And my desire at that point was to be a writer as a result. A lot of these stories were about the struggles that Puerto Ricans had when they came to New York, being working class families, and how difficult it was financially, how racism impacted so many things. He was an Afro-Latino, so his experience was also really important. I could relate a lot of the experiences to my family, how important education was for them in terms of me getting an education and me changing the cycle and the dynamic of what we had access to. And so I started out wanting to be a writer and entered a lot of my community organizing by doing a lot of writing, speech writing, and that sort of thing. But I never connected creating art to activism. I thought it was just something that was completely different. And for me, writing, I think at that time, I really wasn't seeing it as art per se. I wrote a lot of poetry that also was very, activist poetry. But again, I really wasn't seeing it as art. It was just something that it was just so much a part of my life. Eventually, when I went to college, I had always had this desire to study photography. But the first years, I couldn't afford it. It was very difficult for me to be able to purchase a camera. I was on scholarship, so there wasn't additional funding available for me to take an elective just for the sake of taking an elective. And my parents, the thought of me going to school and studying art was scary. I was being raised with a lot of pressure to be a lawyer or a doctor or a teacher or one of these professions that had a lot of security. Art isn't necessarily the most secure game to play. It was scary to think, well, am I going to use my school money to study art? Eventually, I realized that people weren't really reading that much anymore. Things were changing. This was when internet was starting to sneak into our lives and change things. And the world was becoming even more visual. And I'm a visual thinker, so it made sense to transition the work that I wanted to share in my writing to something visual. And I think that once I gave it purpose, I gave myself permission to engage in it. It was difficult for me just to do it for the sake of doing it. I needed to have a reason to do it. Doing it to be able to show what was happening in the community, or creating photography to document the beauty that exists in people who usually are not at the forefront of art as subjects. That gave me permission to create photography in a way that I still am 2 decades later.
As your community organizing work started and the stories that you were telling about the community and the people, what was your 15-year-old's big dream of life? What was the sort of activism? Do you still have that same vision? And is that still the same kind of change that you would want to see?
I wanted people to have opportunity. That was my biggest thing as a community organizer. It was people having equal access to education, people having financial access, people having the opportunity to have access in medical care. So when I was in my early 20s, I started this project, which ended up being my first big art collection. And this art collection actually ended up being exhibited in different places in New York. This was the first time I ever had gallery shows. All of a sudden, there was what here in the United States, they called the Latin explosion. And we had Ricky Martin crossed over into mainstream American media. Jennifer Lopez was really huge. Shakira had just crossed over. And we had all these, Latino artists who were very prominent. But at the same time, there was a lack of diversity in terms of what people looked like that were representing the Latino community in the United States. So what I wanted to do was I wanted to challenge that perception of particularly what Latinas looked like and particularly what their experiences were. And I created this project, Latinatural, where I explored just that. And I had all of these women come in and get photographed. And it was a very interesting experience because it wasn't just people coming in for a set time. It was 20 women in a room having conversations, having a glass of wine, speaking about their experiences, connecting, becoming friends, creating community while they waited for me to photograph them. And the result was phenomenal. The art wasn't so much just the final image. It was the experience in connecting. It was the experience in creating that space for people to talk about things that maybe they wouldn't have had a space to talk about. What the project ended up doing was really exploring body image, diversity in body image, how as women our lives change throughout years, exploring aging, exploring race, which is a really important topic to explore when you're talking about Latino communities and Latino culture. And it was amazing. And I photographed it for around 5 years. And I still would love to reopen the project well over 20 years later and revisit some of the people that I photographed and engage in these conversations again. But 20 something years ago, people were not talking about body image. People were not talking about gender identity the way that they are now. They were not talking about mental health the way that they are now. So this was something that was different. And it was something that was about vulnerability and about trust. And I think above all, it was about love, love for the community, love for ourselves, and creating a platform for people to experience the opportunity to see themselves on an art gallery wall, which was great.
I'm just imagining how you're in the room with these women and they are starting to engage around these issues. And I was wondering how the dynamics in the room changed the project for you, because they must have. There must have been things that people said and shared, and do you still remember things of that sort that really changed the trajectory of the project through the project itself?
Yeah. What was amazing was the community that was formed during each one of these photo shoots really influenced the images themselves. The way that the photo shoots were set up, it was always with the same exact background, a very, very plain background. And all of the women were given one white sheet. That was it. They could decide what they were going to do with that white sheet. So many times I had women come in, we would have a conversation, an initial conversation, and they would say, I don't feel comfortable. I just want you to take a portrait of my face and I'm just going to, wrap myself in the white sheet. They would sit, they would have a conversation with this other group of amazing women. They would share these connections. And then when it was that woman's turn to be photographed, she would decide that she wanted to do a nude, that she felt empowered and that she wanted to really embrace herself and her identity and who she was. And it was deeply therapeutic for all of us, because this was something that I was blessed to capture, but this was an experience that everyone created. So it was, I believe that it was an art experience that everyone who participated in was also an artist in that experience.
Mm-hmm. What gives you most hope and optimism today?
I think that what gives me the most hope and optimism today is the fact that people are finding new ways to have conversations. And I think it's really crucial to do that.
So if we want to really talk specifics about how art and activism can come together in order to maybe to enable these conversations and to create that impact, what are things you would look at, or what are things that you consider important?
If I look at art and I look at activism, I think that there are 3 really important factors. The first thing that we have to take into account is who is creating the art. Historically, people have given value to particular artists. And I think that it's important that as a global community, we expand and we understand that we have the power to give value to whoever we want to give value to in terms of the arts. The second big factor in arts and activism is what is the subject and the message? We also have the autonomy to give value to what the subject and the message is. Historically, in museums, we were used to seeing aristocrats and people who were wealthy hanging on those walls. If we did see someone that was different, they may not have been depicted in a way that was really authentic. So now we are having more conversations about the importance of expanding who is depicted in art and what are those stories that are being told. And then the third element, which I think is super important, is who has access to art. It's so important to expand the access because as humans, we have been creating art since the beginning of time. When archaeologists are digging things up, they're finding out more and more about civilizations as a result of the art that they created. Having access to art is having access to a part of who we are in the greater scheme of humanity. And it is an opportunity for us to connect and to know not only that we can be seen and that we can be heard, but that we have a place at the table, that the table is ours collectively, and that we can enjoy the things that matter just as much as anyone else can and should.
That second point on what the subject is reminded me of this recent exhibit at the Brooklyn Museum on Picasso and his portrayal of women, which was extremely exploitative in a way that stood out to me as such a stark contrast to the work that you just told us about in photographing women in nudes, but from the opposite place, right? It's like a 180 degree change in that, and really them as the authors of their own portrayals, and how that is both so empowering to the subject, but also really changes the types of conversations that we're having about womanhood and the feminine, right?
Exactly. It's interesting because it makes me think about many years ago, I took some classes in fashion photography. I am not a fashion person at all, but I took classes in fashion photography. I found it really interesting. The majority of my classmates were men. I think it was maybe one or two women who were in the class. We would have a model come in, a female model come in, and the photographers had the opportunity to pose her in any way that we wanted. We would each get maybe 10 or 15 minutes with her, and then we would print out what we shot and we would put it all up. And there was this one time that this young woman came in and she posed for us, and we each had our 10 minutes with her. And my professor looks at all of the images and grabs mine and says, "This is what I wanted to see." Everyone else shot her in a way that was not creative, that was more exploitative. And he said, "I could see that a woman shot this." As people, we are so complex. There are so many different sides of who we are. And when we have a subject, that subject may show us a lot of those different sides. But as a photographer, we have the power to decide what is it that we want to highlight. And so when you talk about that Picasso exhibit, it's the same thing. You know, as a painter, he had the power to decide what he was going to show and how he was going to demonstrate it. And as an audience, we have the power to say, yeah, I don't quite agree with that. We can challenge it by also creating what we do feel would be the message that should be juxtaposed to challenge any other one.
A big part of the constraints of our economic system today is that making art is a big risk, right? Like you mentioned, it's a scary decision, and not enough people, I guess, get to do it. And part of your work early on was to also make sure that other people who came from the same place as you and had a similar experience could become artists. Let's say we do succeed in pushing for a well-being economy, and our incentives are entirely different. The things that matter, the things that we value are radically different from what they are today. What would the life of an artist like you look like in that world?
You know, it's funny. I think that more than anything, it would look like just having the opportunity to have access to do what you want to do to express yourself and to make yourself happy without the limitations that exist in doing so. And I think that it's not just for art. I think that's what a well-being economy's goal is in general, to be able to live a life that is dignified and that you can do what brings you joy and what brings joy onto others. So in terms of what a well-being economy would mean for an artist in the future, I think it would be the opportunity to create with purpose and be able to eat. I think that's the most important thing, to be able to eat, to be able to enjoy a meal when you want to enjoy a meal out, to be able to raise your family and to be able to be proud of what you're doing and be compensated for it. I think that not enough people get the compensation that they deserve for what they create.
Yeah. Even before my time at Wheel, you worked with the Wellbeing Economy Alliance on the Free Money Day campaign in New York. Free Money Day is celebrated every 15th of September, and it's a worldwide campaign. It happened in front of the Lehman Brothers, and I think the reason why it is 15th of September, the day, it's because it's the day that they declared bankruptcy, right?
It was the day that they officially collapsed. I don't know if it's that they declared bankruptcy or they just decided to completely fold, but that was the day.
It can happen anywhere on the streets, but the idea is that you set aside some money, you give it to people, and you tell them, this is free money. Take it and give some away to someone else.
I think that day we were given $2. So you give an individual $2 and you say, I'm going to give you $2. You get to keep $1, but I would like for you to give the other $1 to someone else. It's pretty much almost like saying like that $1 is enough. There's enough money to share. Like we do not have to hoard everything. We do not have to hoard our resources. There is enough for everyone. So if I give you 2, well, 1 would be enough.
And I'm curious to hear a bit more about how that went, and especially your perspective as a New Yorker. What did you sense as you were supporting that campaign and seeing, free money being distributed in Wall Street, the world's financial capital? Do you feel that people are becoming more open to these conversations?
It was such fun to participate in the Free Money Day with We All. It was definitely one of my favorite experiences. And what I really, really appreciated and loved about the experience was how such a complex topic was made into an experience that was so simple. The concept of, I will give you this money, you can keep some and you will give some away, was fascinating. I was really surprised by how people bought into the idea and how people started having conversations about how on a wider scale it could be applied to their lives. Like people understood it really quickly. It was also interesting to me that there were some people who they didn't want to participate. And it seemed as though their initial response was, I don't need this. And they just wanted to convince us that they had money. It's almost like you could see their anxiety around perception and money and wealth and wanting to be perceived in a different way, in a certain way. And then there were other people who were really open to just hearing what was happening and what was going on. And I look back, and in high school, I remember that I had a class in economics. I could not relate to it. And at the time, I felt as though it was this world of, that's for this type of person, that's for this universe. I am not part of this universe. I will never be part of this universe. And so I do not need to listen to this. I will never have money. I will never live in a situation in which I can even consider learning about how things work. Now, I wish I would have learned, because I think that learning how things work is the way that you change a system. And I didn't grasp that. For all the activism and all the community organizing I was doing, there was still that disconnect in understanding that I needed to learn about those systems. I didn't just have to be saying these systems have to change.
So what would you tell an artist if they told you that they wanted to be part of the solution, but didn't know how? Little piece of advice.
I would tell them that the first step in being part of the solution is to be true to themselves as an artist. I think that's number one. We can't be part of any solution if we aren't true to ourselves. There's a lot of purpose and there's a lot of power in that. And being true to ourselves should be something that comes out of self-love. When we approach things with self-love, we are more likely to be able to approach others with positivity and self-love. And we are more likely to want better things for society, for our community, and for others. So that's what I would say.
Yeah, that's helpful for me and for the questions I keep asking myself. Thank you for that. Imagine 2023 was a song, a painting, maybe photography, or a book, or a movie maybe. 2023 rethought as a piece of art. What title or name would you give it?
That's interesting. The first thing that came to mind would be Snowglobe. It feels as though everything has been shaken and things are starting to settle in. But it feels as though someone keeps picking up the snow globe and shaking it. And so I think that's what we're experiencing right now. So it would be snow globe. Eventually, hopefully, somebody will put the snow globe down and we can settle everything and see the beautiful image that's inside. But I think we're still living in that.
Thank you for listening. Express Change is supported by the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, the leading collaboration of organizations, alliances, movements, and individuals working to transform the economic system. Find out more at weall.org.
Express Change is produced and edited by Martin Oetting in collaboration with Marina Gattas and the team at the Wellbeing Economy Alliance. You can find out more about my work at martinoetting.com. That's Martin, OETTING.com.